This is page F1, and the clinical name, the anatomic name for skin is the integument. A strange name. And let's first talk about, very briefly, the functions of our skin, and then we'll look at the structure. What is the major function of our skin? Without a doubt, the number one most important role is protection. And it protects us in many ways, our skin. It is a mechanical barrier against the entry of microorganisms. There are all kinds of bad guys, viral particles, bacteria, fungi, and that creates a barrier between preventing them from getting into our body. And that's why when you cut yourself, when you have a wound, an opening in your skin, that creates an entry point for the bacteria or bad guys, the infectious agents, to get into your body. Right? So that's why that creates a problem. Not only does our skin protect us against the entry of bad guys, it also protects us against water loss. You know, our skin is waterproof. You might say, what do you mean our skin is waterproof? You know, when you stand under a shower, right, and the spray of the shower is going on your body and the water just rolls down your skin, you're waterproof. Now the purpose, the benefit of being waterproof is not to prevent the water from getting in. That's not the benefit. The benefit is to prevent the water that's inside you from getting out. You can lie in the hot sun. Let's say you're lying out on the beach, or you're lying out by a pool on a hot day, and we've had some hot days. You can lie out there for hours. You shouldn't, because of the harmful sunlight. We'll get to that in a moment. But you can lie out there for hours without dehydrating. We're not jellyfish. We're not a snail. You put a snail out in the hot sun, it'll shrivel up and die in a matter of a certain number of minutes. We can lie out in the hot sun for hours because our skin is waterproof and it prevents the water that's inside of us from evaporating and us shriveling up. Our skin also protects us against harmful ultraviolet rays from the sun. And ultraviolet rays are a type of radiation. And radiation, including ultraviolet rays, can damage skin cells in a couple of ways. They can burn your skin. Many of us have had a sunburn. And even more seriously, those harmful ultraviolet rays can mutate the DNA in our skin cells. You'd say, well, so what if you mutate the DNA in your skin cells? That causes a normal skin cell to change into a cancerous skin cell. The most common cause, the major factor that leads to skin cancer is too much harmful ultraviolet rays. The people who have to be most careful are those with less protective melanin in their skin. Melanin, we know, is a brown-colored protein in our skin cells. Some people have a genetic defect. They can't make that protein. And when you cannot make a protein, that's called a genetic disease. If you can't make specifically melanin, we say you're an albino. You have albinism. They have no melanin at all. And therefore they have no shielding or protection at all from harmful ultraviolet rays. So they have to be very careful. And other people who have melanin but are fairer skinned, they have some protection. But obviously, now an interesting thing happens in everybody when you repeatedly expose your skin to ultraviolet rays for several days. Your skin cells start to make more and more melanin, and your skin darkens. We call that tanning, okay? But that's more increased production of melanin. So anyhow, that's to shield us against harmful ultraviolet rays. Our skin is also a sensory organ. It's an extraordinary sensory organ. We've got so many millions of sensory neurons in our skin, especially our fingers. And our fingers really should be thought of as a special sensory organ. And let me just kind of convey to you just how important our sensory neurons in our fingers are. For people who cannot see, who are blind, how does a blind person read? With Braille, but using their fingers, right? They rub their fingers on the surface of little bumps, And those are how they read. And so if you don't have the sight, your fingers become the replacement for vision. And they're still important even when we do have vision. So we have sense all kinds of things. These sensory neurons are known as receptors. We have thermoreceptors and touch receptors and pressure receptors. All kinds of different receptors or sensory neurons in our skin. Another function of our skin is it plays a very important role in heat balance, temperature regulation, and in a couple of ways. In our skin, there are sweat glands. And when we become overheated, because it's a hot day or because we're exercising, which generates heat, our sweat glands sweat, and the evaporation of the sweat cools us off. But I do want to emphasize this, in order to cool us off, the sweat must actually evaporate. When it's really humid, the sweat doesn't evaporate, it just rolls down your skin, and therefore it does not cool you down. So it has to evaporate. So that's why some people can tolerate dry heat much better than humid heat. You go out to the dry desert, so like Palm Springs, it may be real hot, but at least the sweat evaporates and cools you down. If it's really humid and moist out, then you just sweat, and the sweat rolls down your skin. It doesn't evaporate, and it doesn't cool you down, so it becomes miserable. And anybody who's been to the East Coast in the summer knows what I mean by humidity, all right, where it's like a steam room. It's not just dry desert heat. A second way that our skin is involved in heat balance is by controlling the flow of blood through the vessels in our skin. Now, many blood vessels everywhere in our body constrict. That means they narrow or they dilate. They get wider. But specifically, when the vessels in our skin, which are called cutaneous, the word cutaneous means skin, when these vessels in our skin constrict or dilate, that's used to adjust heat loss. Here's how it works. When we're overheated, the blood vessels in our skin dilate. They get wider. That's called cutaneous vasodilation. That increases the flow of warm red blood to the surface of your skin. And people who are fairer skin, they get all flushed. That just it happens in all of us, but you can really see it obviously. And that just increases heat loss. Now you can demonstrate this. Everybody can demonstrate it. All you have to do is immerse your hands in hot water. Look at your palms of your hands. You'll see they turn all red. That's the vessels in the skin dilating, increasing the flow of warm red blood to get rid of heat. Now, on the other hand, when we're cold, when we're chilled, the vessels in our skin do just the opposite. They constrict. And when the vessels in our skin constrict, that means they get narrower. That reduces the flow of blood in our skin, and that reduces heat loss. And again, you can easily demonstrate this. Just immerse your hands in icy cold water, and it will look like all the blood went out of your hand. It just turns very pale, very pallid, like there's no blood in your hands anymore. So that's the vessels constricting. So in those two ways, our skin plays a key role in heat balance, in temperature regulation. Letter D, a fourth function of our skin is the synthesis of vitamin D. And we've mentioned vitamin D today. Let me tell you how this works. Our skin is actually a gland. It produces a hormone. Most of us don't think of our skin as producing a hormone, but in fact it does. The name of the steroid hormone, it is a steroid hormone made from cholesterol. The name of the steroid hormone produced in our skin is called calcitriol or calciferol. We'll call it calciferol. It goes by a few names because of the biochemical pathway. Now, in order for your skin to make this steroid hormone, all steroid hormones are made from cholesterol. Cholesterol is not a bad thing. Too much of it is bad. Just like sugar's not bad, just too much of it is bad. Salt's not bad, just too much of it is bad. So cholesterol is actually used to make steroid hormones, including this calciferol hormone. In order for our skin to convert cholesterol into this steroid hormone, it requires sunlight. Now you might say, wait a second, you just told us sunlight is harmful, sunlight is bad. Well again, too much ultraviolet sunlight is bad, but that doesn't mean you don't need any. You do need some, you just don't want to get out too much where you're burning and getting a sunburn and causing skin cancer. Nobody says no sun is good. So we actually need sunlight that help us convert cholesterol into this steroid hormone called calciferol. Now what does calciferol, this steroid hormone, do? It's secreted into the bloodstream, it circulates in our bloodstream, and but where it specifically acts is it increases the absorption of calcium in our small intestine. Now, if this hormone, this calciferol steroid hormone, is circulating everywhere in our bloodstream, how come it only primarily affects the cells of our intestine and not other cells? How could it affect the steroid hormone just affect some cells but not all the cells of our body? Receptor sites, right? We've learned that. We need to know that for the test. That the receptor sites on a cell determine which hormones affect which cells. They have receptor sites for that hormone. So our skin actually makes this hormone that's needed to absorb calcium. Now here's the problem. You know, we just don't, in a modern world, we don't spend that much time outside. All right, and even children who used to go and play a lot outside now are indoors playing video games. So, and as adults, you know, we're no longer shepherds, we're not farmers. We are nurses and working inside a hospital for 12-hour shifts. We're accountants, we're teachers. I'm indoors all the whole time. And we wear a lot of clothes, and we don't get really, many of us don't get enough sunlight to make enough of this steroid hormone. So nutritionists in the 1930s, 1940s recognized that in American society, they were really concerned about children not getting enough sunlight and making enough of this steroid hormone to absorb calcium, and children need calcium for growing bones and teeth. So they decided, they advocated, and it was approved by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to add this steroid hormone to milk. Because mothers commonly encourage their children to drink milk. It's a good source of calcium for growing bones and teeth. The problem is this. If you tell people that they're putting a steroid hormone in your milk, how do most people interpret that? Do they like hearing that they put a steroid hormone in the milk? No. So instead of calling it a steroid hormone, calciferol, they called it vitamin D. What is vitamin D? A steroid hormone. What's interesting is when you tell people they put vitamin D in the milk, they say, I love that. Which brand has the highest amount? So everybody agrees they put a chemical in the milk, but if you call it a steroid hormone, they don't like it. If you call it a vitamin, they love it. So it's the words we use affect people's perception, but it's the same thing. That's what vitamin D is. It's a steroid hormone. And simply they put it there so that that way when you drink the milk containing calcium, the hormone is also there and it causes the calcium to be absorbed in the body, and therefore you don't develop rickets, which is what happens when you don't have enough vitamin D or that steroid hormone. Therefore you don't absorb enough calcium and the bones of a child are weak. All right, so now you've got the whole story of that with rickets. Now here on the bottom right, and technically the skin is the largest organ of our body. It's the largest organ of our body. Does anybody remember, and you need to know this for the test, which is the, what's the definition of an organ? Very good. Excellent. Any structure made up of two or more tissues. Some of you are saying, when did he ever tell us that? The answer is bottom of page D1. Bottom of page D1. So the skin is made up of two tissues. So technically it's an organ. Any structure made up of two or more tissues is an organ. So even though we don't commonly think of skin as an organ, technically it is the largest organ in the body. Now, on page F2, on F2, we're going to come back to that picture in just a moment. There are natural openings or portals in our skin. And these are important to know. You'd say, why? because we said the most important function of the skin is it creates a mechanical barrier, protects us from the entry of bad guys. Where there's an opening in our skin is an opening, a portal for bad guys to enter into our body. These are the major portals, the natural portals where bad guys, infectious agents enter into our body. So the mouth. So a lot of bad guys enter through our mouth, with our food, with whatever we put in our mouth, right? That introduces bacteria and viruses and other things into our body. The nares, or nostrils, whatever we breathe air through our nose, as well as our mouth, but through our nose, now any viruses, any bacteria, anything floating in the air, now it enters into our body, because that's an opening. The anus, that's the opening at the other end of the mouth, right? Then we've got a mouth at this end, and the other end of the alimentary canal, the anus, that's another entry point. The urethral canal. The urethral canal is the opening that urine comes out. You'd say, well, what's it called in women? The urethral canal. You'd say, well, what's it called in men where the urine comes out? The urethral canal. If urine comes out, it's called the urethral, or urethral canal. That's another entry point. And especially in women, and we'll learn why later, are especially prone to urinary tract infections, because that's another natural portal or opening into the body where bad guys enter. Women have an additional opening that guys do not have. That's the vaginal canal, the birth canal, or vaginal opening. Guys have one opening. The urethral canal is not only for urine to come out, but also sperm. But women have a separate opening for reproductive function, separate from the opening for urine. That's the vaginal canal, and women do get vaginal infections. So these are the natural entry points into the body. Now, just a drop further here. The layers of skin, the layers of skin. We have learned that skin is made up of two layers, epidermis and dermis. Again, you need to know this for the test, for first exam. The top layer is called epidermis. Top skin is literally what it means. The lower layer is dermis. Now, these two layers of skin have different embryologic origins, and they are two different types of tissues. And let's just remind you of this. The epidermis is stratified squamous epithelium. That's the type of tissue it is. Now, we know the skin on the surface of our body exposed to air has dead cells on the top, so it's called keratinizing, which just means there's some dead cells on the surface. Another thing that distinguishes the epidermis that's in contact with air from the epidermis on the inside of our mouth is that since it's exposed to sunlight, it has melanin, brown melanin. There's no melanin inside your mouth because there's no sunlight there, and there's no dead cells. And furthermore, we know that the epidermis, the stratified squamous epithelium, developed from the ectoderm of the embryo, the top layer. Now, in contrast, on F3, on the next page, F3, the dermis, here on F3, the dermis we wrote is much thicker than the epidermis. It is made up of irregularly arranged, dense fibrous connective tissue. We learned that on D11, page D11. The dermis is made up of irregularly arranged, dense fibrous connective tissue. This is a connective tissue, totally different from an epithelial tissue, which makes up the epidermis. This tissue is made up of fibroblast cells and collagen. And the collagen is kind of swirling around in all different directions. That's what we mean by irregularly arranged. Furthermore, this tissue developed from the embryo, from the mesoderm layer of the embryo, as do all connective tissues. So that part you have to know for the test. Now the last thing I just want to draw your attention to, let's go back to page F1. So on page F1, let's just look at this picture. So on F1, this is showing a kind of three-dimensional cutaway view of the skin. And this, here, bracketed, this is the epidermis right here. And this is the dermis. The dermis is much thicker than the epidermis. And those are the two layers of skin. Now down here, this is labeled subcutaneous. subcutaneous layer. Now, sub means under or below. Cutaneous, what does cutaneous mean? Skin. Did we talk about the blood vessels in our skin are called cutaneous blood vessels? So subcutaneous means below the skin. Yes, we can give sub-Q injections. All right? And just looking at this, it's known as subcutaneous or hypodermis. What would hypodermis mean? Under the dermis. Just looking at this, what kind of tissue does this look like? Adipose. Fat cells. That's subdermal fat. Right? That's subdermal fat. So don't we have fat underneath our skin? Some places more fat than other places. All right, so that's the adipose tissue. So we're starting to understand what the body looks like. Now, just as we finish this up, here you'll notice it shows blood vessels. Here, these are these cutaneous blood vessels. They're actually labeled right here. It says blood vessel. All right, so here's blood vessels. Notice there are blood vessels in this connective tissue. Connective tissues are characteristically vascularized. Look at the blood vessels and notice they stop right here. Can everybody see that? They come right here and they stop. Right there they stop. Because that's epidermis and that's an epithelial tissue. And a characteristic of epithelial tissues, stratified squamous epithelium, is they don't have blood vessels. So that's why the nutrients just kind of have to diffuse to nourish those cells. But the connective tissues have lots of blood vessels. That was a characteristic difference between epithelial and connective tissues. So we're starting to see how this works. And skin, incidentally, is an important subject no matter what clinical field you want to go into. You're learning about skin. Now, here you can see hair follicles, and this is a sweat gland. And you can see here's the sweat gland. It has this tube or duct, and it can release sweat to the outer surface. And here's a hair follicle. This is labeled a sebaceous gland. We will be learning sebaceous glands are oil glands that release oil right around the hair follicle. And this is a muscle. This muscle is labeled an arrector Pili muscle. Now, Pili means hair. Some of you may have heard that when women, let's say, put something to remove hair on their legs, that's called a depilatory. It removes hair. Pili means hair. Arrector Pili, this muscle, when it contracts, causes the pili, the hair, to stand erect, upright. So you'd say, well, I don't get that. What do you mean our hair stands upright? We'll talk about this more at another time. These are called goosebumps or goose pimples, like when you're cold or frightened, right? Your hair stands up. And that's these muscles contracting that cause the hairs to stand up. It shows down here something labeled an autonomic motor neuron. Now, this autonomic motor neuron is shown, and it looks like this autonomic motor neuron has branches that go to the arrector Pili muscle. It has branches that go to this cutaneous blood vessel. It has branches of the autonomic motor neuron that go to the sebaceous gland. It has branches that go to the sweat gland. What's all that about? So I wrote right up here, there are actually two types of motor neurons. Two types of motor neurons. You'd say, like, what do you mean? Motor neurons, as we will be learning, is the name of the neurons that activate our body to do stuff. They are what control or activate the organs of our body to do something. And there are two categories of motor neurons that activate our organs. There are somatic motor neurons and there are autonomic motor neurons. Somatic motor neurons allow voluntary control of our skeletal muscles. So what activates our skeletal muscles in our fingers, right, in our arms, are somatic motor neurons, and they are under voluntary control. I have voluntary control over my finger muscles, over my arm muscles. Those are skeletal muscles. Autonomic motor neurons, this second type of motor neuron, are for the automatic control of visceral organs. The word visceral means internal. You'd say, when did we ever learn that? Page A3, parietal and visceral. Visceral means internal organ. Parietal means wall. Visceral means internal organ, page A3. So the autonomic motor neurons are for the automatic control of our internal organs. And they are controlled automatically and do not allow us to have voluntary control over them. So what's an example of that? So it says in this picture, this is an autonomic motor neuron. And what is it controlling? One of the things it's shown controlling is this arrector Pili muscle. So that autonomic motor neuron, when you're cold or frightened, this autonomic motor neuron makes that muscle contract and your hair stand up, and you don't have voluntary control over that. The autonomic motor neuron has a branch that goes to the sweat gland. When you get overheated, you start to sweat. You can't control your sweating. If you're sweating, you can't stop it. And if you're not sweating, you can't make it happen. But your nervous system is automatically controlling that sweat gland. Same thing with this oil or sebaceous gland is controlled by the autonomic motor neuron. And also these cutaneous blood vessels. When you get overheated, those vessels dilate in your skin. When you're too cold, they constrict. This is automatically controlled by autonomic motor neurons. So the somatic motor neurons allow voluntary control of our skeletal muscles, the muscles attached to our bones that allow us to move. And autonomic, kind of sounds like automatic motor neurons automatically control our internal organs. Last thought, can you speed up your heart? Go ahead, make your heart speed up. Go ahead. Slow it down. Stop your heart. Okay, how about let's make your gallbladder release some bile. Go ahead. All right. So we can't control, our nervous system is controlling it, but it's controlled automatically. We're going to have a lot more to say about neural control of our body. Okay, this is page F2, and let's go through the epidermis and dermis. Now there's a picture here of the skin, the two layers of the skin right here, the epidermis and the underlying dermis. And as far as the epidermis, we know that it's made up of keratinizing, stratified squamous epithelium. And the dead cells that are at the very top are commonly called keratinocytes. That's a name for the dead cells, because keratinizing, or keratin refers to these dead cells. Now, you'll notice that in this picture, they actually subdivide the epidermis into many different layers. And you'll notice this is labeled stratum corneum, and stratum spinosum, and stratum basal, stratum germinativum. So in the textbook and in the lab manual, they subdivide even this stratified squamous epithelium of the epidermis into many sublayers. I'm only going to ask you to know two, just two. And the two we're going to ask you to know are the very top layer, the stratum corneum, and the lower layer, the stratum germinativum. So let's explain what those are. The stratum germinativum is the bottom layer of cells. Some of those cells in the lower layer contain melanin protein. Now, in fact, not all the cells in the lower layer will have melanin protein, but those that do are called melanocytes because they contain melanin. Now, we have learned that any cell in our body can become transformed into a cancerous cell. Normal liver cells can become liver cancer cells. Normal lung cells can become lung cancer cells. Breast cells can be, epithelial cells in the breast can become breast cancer cells. When melanocytes become cancerous, that's called a melanoma. And a melanoma is the most aggressive of all the skin cancers. So if you've ever heard that term melanoma, that's when the melanocytes become transformed into cancerous cells. Now, why this lower layer is called stratum, and stratum means layer, germinativum, is because, as we said before, the word germinate is like when you plant a seed in the soil, it germinates or grows. This is called the stratum or germinativum layer because that's the layer that's actively growing, that's undergoing cell division. So the cells, the growth of the epidermis grows from the lower part and pushes upwards. The top cells are not undergoing cell division. Now, on page F3, at the top, the other layer we said we wanted you to know is the top layer called the stratum corneum. That's the name for the layer, the top layer where the dead cells are, the keratinocytes. And they're called keratinocytes because these dead cells contain a lot of a protein called keratin. Now, keratin is the same protein that makes up your nails. Your nails are pure keratin protein. And so this same protein is in these top dead cells. And that's what makes the top layer waterproof, because they contain this kind of protein called keratin. And that's why they're called keratinocytes. Now, we wrote in item number 5 that external pressure on your skin, constantly applying repeated pressure to your skin, will stimulate that layer of the skin to grow thicker. It will cause that area where we're constantly putting pressure on it to grow thicker. And you might say, I don't get that. So an example of what I'm saying is, let's say you got a job, and your job is to take a broom and to sweep a lot. So you will develop calluses, where the hand stick of the broomstick, where you're constantly pushing against your skin. So a callus is simply where stimulation by that broomstick, that pressure stimulates the growth of the cells, the skin cells, to grow thicker. Now, of course, by standing much of the day, it causes the sole of our feet to grow thicker. So that's why the skin on the sole of our feet is quite thick, and it also tends to be relatively thick on the palms of our hand. So our body is alive, and it responds to pressures or external stimuli. Incidentally, while we commonly call the thickening on our hands calluses, the thickening of skin on our toes is usually called corns. But it's the same idea. A corn is a thickening of the skin on the foot, and a callus is a thickening of the skin on the hand. Now, I added number 6 here, friction ridges. What are friction ridges? So if we go back to the previous page, F2, you'll notice that right here at the top, we indicated there are so-called friction ridges. First off, you say, I don't know what those are. Here's how you know them better. On the bottom of F3, you know them better as fingerprints. Fingerprints are friction ridges. Now, we know that each person has a kind of unique pattern of these friction ridges on their fingers, and that's why they're used for identification purposes. And we have not only these friction ridges on the palms of our hand, we also have them on the soles of our feet. If commonly, when newborn babies are born, they'll have footprints, on the birth certificates. Have you ever seen those? So you can see the footprint ridges. What's the purpose of these friction ridges? The purpose of them, as we wrote here, is to facilitate grasping and traction. Just imagine if you were going to get gloves, and you had a choice between a smooth glove and a glove with ridges. Which one would make it easier to pick up a thin dime? The one with the ridges. It gives you some traction, some grasping ability. So the purpose of these ridges, these friction ridges, is for grasping with our hands, or if we're walking or running barefoot, traction while running barefoot. All right, we've been talking about the top layer skin, the epidermis. What about the dermis? It's much thicker than the epidermis. It's made up of irregularly arranged dense fibrous connective tissue made up of fibroblasts and collagen. We originally talked about it on D11. It develops from mesoderm, and like most connective tissues, it has a lot of blood vessels and it has a lot of nerve fibers. What are papillary folds? We can explain that by looking at the previous page, and the picture on the previous page, I pointed to these folds as papillary folds. And The papillary folds simply demonstrate the following, and I'll just draw a picture here. Draw an amazing picture. Okay, so what we have, in other words, our skin is not organized like this. It's not like we just have the epidermis and the dermis. You'd say it isn't? No, what our skin looks like is it looks like this. We have the epidermis, and we have these papillary folds. Here's the dermis. So it interdigitates. Interdigitates. And you might say, what is that? Okay, all right, here's what our skin looks like. So here's the idea. The two layers interdigitate. The word interdigitate means to put your fingers between each other. Now the purpose of this is so that if the epidermis was lying flat on the dermis, if it looked like this, then rubbing your skin, the epidermis would slide over the dermis. But because they interdigitate with each other like this, when you rub your surface of your skin, they cannot separate. The epidermis cannot move against the surface of the dermis because they interdigitate. So the purpose of this interdigitating of because of these papillary folds is to prevent the two layers of skin from separating. That's the purpose of it, to prevent the two layers of skin from separating apart. Nevertheless, with the repeated rubbing of your skin, when you repeatedly rub your skin, the two layers will still start to pull apart from each other. What would be an example of this? If you put on a new pair of shoes, and that shoe is rubbing over and over against your heel, what do you develop? A blister. What's a blister? It's where the epidermis pulled away from the dermis and a pocket of fluid accumulated between the epidermis and dermis. So what a blister is fluid accumulating where the epidermis and dermis have separated or pulled apart. That's what a blister is. Everybody follow that? So it reduces, the fact that they interdigitate reduces this tendency to separate, but it doesn't prevent it with repeated friction or rubbing. Okay, we've talked about on F3, and one last comment about these fingerprints or footprints. We've said that each individual has a unique pattern that's used for identification purposes. One question that I'm commonly asked is, what about identical twins? Would they have identical fingerprints? And the answer is, we know that who we are, what we are, is a combination of nature and nurture, genetic factors and environmental factors. So, in fact, identical twins are going to have almost identical fingerprints, but not absolutely identical. Most fingerprint people probably would not be able to tell the difference with identical twins, but people who are really good at what they do would be able to tell these very ever so slight differences. But they would be very close, very similar, but not absolutely identical. On page F4, thank you. On F4, subcutaneous layer, we've already learned that there's subdermal fat. We're going to be learning about what's below the skin besides subdermal fat or subcutaneous layers. How we've heard this term hypodermis, which is another word for subcutaneous. Subcu means below the skin, hypodermis means under the dermis. All of us have heard the term hypodermic syringe. And so that's where you give an injection under the dermis. Here, what we've spoken of next is hair. Well, let's talk a little bit about hair. So first off, we had learned for our first exam that even during fetal development, a very fine peach fuzz hair grows all over the surface of the body, including the face, called lanugo. And that lanugo then falls out a few days after the birth of the baby. Now, during childhood, we have hair on our legs and on our arms, and it's usually thin and light, but certainly thin. And then, beginning at puberty, the hair, not only does the hair on our arms and legs start to grow in thicker and darker, but also hair starts to grow in places in our body where it never grew before at puberty. So this is known as terminal hair. It sounds like we're going to die from it, terminal. But terminal means adult hair. And it's thicker, it's darker, and it begins to grow at puberty. Now, where do we find the hair? In a newborn, they typically are born with a head full of hair, although it may fall out soon after birth. And there is that peach fuzz or lanugo all over their skin. At puberty, we mentioned hair starts to grow in places where it never grew before, besides just the arms and legs, including the pubic area, that's around the genital area, axillary hair, that's the armpit, and facial and chest hair, which is obviously more prominent in guys. Guys are hairier in general. Now, here in the picture, it shows a hair follicle, and there's two things we want to talk about with respect to this hair follicle. Associated with every hair follicle is a sebaceous or oil gland, and also an arrector pili muscle. And we've mentioned that muscle before. It causes the hair to stand upright. Let's say a little bit more about the arrector pili muscle. So when that muscle causes the hair to stand upright, that's called piloerection, which almost sounds dirty, right? Piloerection. It means the hair is standing erect. And this creates what are called goosebumps or goose pimples. Now, the two common things that will cause the arrector pili muscle to contract, causing our hairs to stand upright, are cold and fright. Now, the only explanation I can offer for this is what evolutionary biologists would describe. So here's what they would say. Let's talk about a cat for a moment rather than a human. So when a cat is cold, it puts its fur, its hair out more to trap more heat. So the idea is that when an animal is cold and it has hair, fur, it sticks it out to trap more heat better. And that's what all animals with hair do. Now, we just don't have enough hair to really accomplish that. Secondly, thinking about the cat, let's say the cat is being chased by a dog. And it's now cornered, right? So the dog is growling at the cat. The cat will stick its fur out, which makes it appear bigger. In fact, if you've ever seen a wet cat, it's like cats are really scrawny animals. They're all fur. Isn't that right? Anybody ever seen a wet cat? There's nothing to them. So all this fur, when they stick it out, it makes them appear more intimidating, larger. So they think that's the reason why it happens. So we don't have enough fur or hair to stick out that makes us more intimidating, but that's the explanation as to why cold and fright cause the same response that it does in a cat. So that's the hair stands up and we get the goosebumps. Okay, now in terms of the sebaceous gland or oil gland, on the next page on F5, so in F5, the oil glands are always located by hair follicles. And they secrete this sebum or oil. And the purpose of the oil is to keep our skin pliable and flexible. Let's think about this for a moment. We have hair almost on every part of our body. We don't have a lot of hair everywhere in our body, but we have some hair almost everywhere in our body, except two places. There are two places where nobody has hair. The palms of your hand. Nobody's got hair on the palms of your hands unless you're a hobbit. Okay? And the soles of your feet. Okay, now, why don't we have hair there? Because it would be difficult to grasp things if we had all this fur, and it would be difficult to run, at least barefoot, if we had all these fur-colored, covered soles of our feet. So this gives us more traction. Now, because we don't have hair on the palms of our hand or the soles of our feet, we don't have any oil glands there either. Because we said the oil glands are always located where there's hair. So, where do we tend to notice that our skin gets dried out the most? On our palms of our hand, on our hands. Isn't that why you have hand lotion? All right? And while your soles of your feet may not be very dried out, how about elderly people? The soles of their feet the skin cracks. It's so dry and hard, it cracks. So people, when they get older, have to actually put oil on the soles of their feet because the skin gets very dried out and cracks because there's no oil glands there. We may have skin getting dried out elsewhere, but it doesn't tend to get as bad as in those places, on the hands and the soles of the feet. We wrote that the secretion of oil by our oil glands is stimulated by sex hormones. So estrogen in females and testosterone in males both stimulate these sebaceous or oil glands to secrete more oil. Now, about what age do you start to secrete sex hormones? At puberty. And what happens to people's skin around puberty? It gets all oily. All right? So that's release of sex hormones is what causes skin to get oilier at puberty. Now, the expression in English, blackhead, refers to this oil or sebum clogging up right around the hair follicle. And that's not the scientific name. It's actually called a condom. I won't ask you to know that. But that's the common English expression, is a blackhead where the dried up oil starts to accumulate right around the hair follicle. People will like squeeze it just to squeeze the old dried oil out from around the hair follicle. What are pimples and boils? That's an infection of the sebaceous glands, of the oil glands. So there are bacteria that can infect the sebaceous glands. And in micro, you will hear of a bacteria called Corynebacteria acnes and Staphylococcus aureus. And these are different bacteria that infect the oil glands, and that causes a pimple or a boil. That's where it's all infected. Okay, the Sudoriferous glands are sweat glands. That's the scientific name for sweat, just sudoriferous. Don't worry, I don't know why I wrote we don't have sweat glands on our lips, ears, or nipples. I won't test you on that. Sweat is mostly water and salt, NaCl, sodium chloride. It also has a little bit of a waste product called urea in sweat. And I guess that's where this notion came from, that if you go and sweat, you go into a sauna and sweat, people say, oh, you get rid of all those toxins, all those poisons. Well, we do get rid of a little bit of urea when we sweat, but actually we get rid of a lot more when you just go out and pee. So, if you're worried about the urea, instead of sitting in a sauna, just go and do number one, and you'll get rid of a lot more of it. We've already mentioned today that sweat only cools us down if it evaporates. If it does not evaporate, if it just rolls down your skin, it's not cooling you off. Now, another type of gland in our skin are scent glands. Scent means smell or odor. And as far as where are they are around under our armpits. These are kind of modified sweat glands that also secrete chemicals that create a smell or odor. They're in the genital area, in the inguinal or groin area, and around the anus, the perianal area. Now, the original purpose for these scent glands is sexual attraction. And certainly, if you ever see two dogs meet on the street, what do they start doing? Sniffing. They immediately start sniffing. The male especially will start sniffing the female. And where are they sniffing? Around the anus, the genital, or under the legs. That's where they're sniffing. And if they smell the right way, the male will start to mount the female right there in the street. So it gets a little embarrassing to see that. But that's the purpose of the scent glands. Interestingly, we as humans have a mixed feeling about our scent glands. You'd say, what do you mean? So on the one hand, we generally don't like our own scent or BO, body odor. So like, you kind of You smell yourself and you say, boy, do I need a shower, or something like that. And then we try to cover up our own body smell by putting body washes or perfumes or other fragrances to kind of conceal. However, it's interesting when we look at the names of these perfumes and aftershaves that men and women wear, think about their names, like ecstasy, obsession. Aren't those the name? Brute. You know, the names of these things are implying a sexual connotation. So in other words, people, while they may not like their own smell, they want to put on other smells that are really sexy, you know, to attract attention. Having said that we don't necessarily like our own smells, on the other hand, scientific studies have shown that they've actually taken these t-shirts that guys have worn, and they will hand them to women. And they'll ask the group of women to smell these shirts that guys have worn. And they'll smell some shirts, and any given woman will say, "Woo, that stinks." And then they'll take another shirt that a guy's worn, and they'll say, "I like that smell." So these are called pheromones, these smells. So there is something to this idea of smell, and this may relate to what we call, you know, in terms of sexual attraction, chemistry. You know, sometimes you meet somebody, and they're everything you're looking for, except there's just no sexual attraction or chemistry. And other times, they've got nothing that you're looking for, but there's something that's really sexy, or there's a chemistry about that person. So we think that this may be these scents, these chemicals that are being released from our scent glands. The ceruminous glands are the wax glands. These are located in our external auditory meatus. That seems pretty familiar. And the purpose of this cerumen or wax is to protect the eardrum, to protect it a little bit. Now, of course, some people over-secrete wax, and they have to have their ears cleaned, or they have to make a point of cleaning them. Now, the mammary glands. Talk about the mammary glands. So the mammary gland, we see the nipple, and the surrounding dark pigmented area is called the areola. Before I go any further, let me point out what should be obvious, but it sometimes isn't. Guys also have nipples and an areola, right? Sometimes we kind of forget that. Just that guys do not have functioning mammary glands, but they still have a nipple and areola. Now, on the areola area, there are little bumps that become more prominent in women who are nursing. They become more prominent during pregnancy and then prominent during nursing. These little bumps on the surface of the areola are known as areolar glands, or glands of Montgomery, named after the great Dr. Montgomery, who devoted his entire life to studying these little bumps. But you can imagine getting a research grant, you know, for that. But the purpose of these areolar glands, or glands of Montgomery, is they secrete an oil that lubricates around the areola and nipple. You'd say, well, like, I don't get that. Well, women who are nursing their baby, that rooting or sucking action of the baby chafes the nipple. It really makes it raw with repeated nursing. So the purpose of these areolar glands is to secrete a lubricant. Even then, it's still not usually sufficient, and women who nurse their babies still usually have to lubricate the nipples because of the chafing or the irritation caused by the rooting action or sucking action of the baby. Now, we'll talk a little bit about what the mammary glands secrete. The mammary glands initially secrete a clear fluid called colostrum that is produced beginning around the first day after birth. So by the time of birth, a clear fluid will be released if the baby suckles on the mother's breast. And what is colostrum? It appears clear, like a clear fluid. It's mostly water. It does contain low amounts of a sugar called lactose, and it's got some antibodies. Overall, there's not much nourishment, in the colostrum. On the next page, on F6, usually most women who are nursing their baby don't start to produce milk until 3 or 4 days after the birth of the baby. In other words, most women do not have milk immediately when the baby is born. It takes a few days for the milk to start to be produced by the mammary glands. Now, milk, unlike colostrum, is very high in nutrients. It's extremely high in lactose and high in fat. In fact, human mother's milk is higher in sugar, lactose sugar, and higher in fat than cow's milk. It is also high in calcium and also antibodies. It's got other nutrients as well, but that's what it's especially high in. So again, this takes a few days to produce the milk. Now, in order for the milk to be produced, the baby has to continuously or has to periodically suckle on the breast to cause this production of milk. And when a mother weans her baby, meaning when she stops having the baby suckle on her breast, the mammary glands, quote, dry up. They stop producing the milk. So this production of milk is dependent upon nursing, the baby suckling or nursing. Most doctors today recommend that women, if they're able to nurse their baby at least for a month or so. Most women don't tend nowadays to nurse their baby for too many months. And really, most women stop by 6 months for sure. You'd say, well, isn't it healthy to go even beyond 6? Yeah, but there's a problem that develops. You know what starts to happen in that baby by 6 months? It grows teeth. And having a baby's teeth on the nipple is a whole different story. So the teeth are up by 6 months. So there's no, but by that time the baby can eat. It doesn't have to rely on milk. Now, there are many hormones that are involved in stimulating the growth and development of the mammary glands. And in this diagram, it mentions, you can see estrogen and lactogen and progesterone and prolactin and oxytocin. We're going to talk about these hormones when we get to section Q on endocrinology. And that's when we'll tell you about all these different hormones. So we're not going to talk about those now.